Hey, good morning, everyone. Hope you're all having a wonderful week so far. I wanted to continue what we started last week with our news cycle. There's been plenty of news that has been, raking up over the last number of days. Some very monumental news, some kind of progressions and evolutions of what we've seen previously. But I wanted to kind of go through some of the kind of big highlights and potentially what your thoughts are. So after I post this video in the discussion forums, feel free to comment below on your thoughts, opinions, and we can kind of get a good dialogue started. So in the last number of days and weeks, the Supreme Court has been absolutely pounding away at all of the legislation. In a huge historic landmark, they've actually sided with transgender workers recently. And so they extended the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to include transgender people under the umbrella of protection so that they will not be discriminated against, when it comes to, work, employment, housing, etc. Honestly, this one was a big shocker for me. Just because as soon as Donald Trump started to, place more conservative, justices on the Supreme Court, I thought all of this was completely going to skew into a conservative realm. However, Justice Roberts actually sided with the liberals on this one, so that was a huge upset. And President Trump was not too keen or happy with this one, but definitely for the LGBTQ community, this is a huge win. In other news for the Supreme Court, they also went in and looked at a Louisiana law that was prohibiting and limiting some, not some, but a lot of access to abortions and abortion clinics. And so they went in and said that that was unconstitutional for them to restrict access because I forgot what the specific numbers were. I read it on another page, but it was something like there was only a few or a handful of clinics to serve something like 10,000 plus women in the community. It was completely disproportionate, and so they ruled that it's unconstitutional to limit this. And so once again, this was a huge upset, something I did not see coming, just because the conservative court was going to, in everyone's minds and opinions, right, kind of go against the grain of, let's say, the more liberal policies and views of abortion, but also a huge upset. However, they did come back and swing yesterday, because I'm recording this on Wednesday, July 1st, but yesterday on Tuesday, they actually made a more conservative call. And so typically, religious schools in this country have not been privy to any state or federal aid or funds because they're private schools. But now they actually said that these schools should be highly considered for aid and tax incentive programs and such. Now, this was very split, once again, 5-4 decision. And we're going to start seeing this specific number, the 5-4 decision split, more and more. However, I do have to give a grim warning to all of my students who might be on the liberal spectrum that Justice Ginsburg is becoming, more and more increasingly ill as time goes on and as the years go on. And although I absolutely love her, I don't know if her health is going to last, for, let's say, another Trump term, which is a few years. So if that happens, then we're going to see the 5-4 decisions start to skew even more into 6-3 decisions, right? Because the conservative liberal nature of the U.S. Supreme Court is going to be even more on the conservative side. So possibly all of these types of cases are going to continue. But the importance of this case is because typically within like traditional government classes in high school or anything else, they teach you about the separation of church and state. The United States fundamentally was created in order to have a separation of church and state, and yes, allow religious freedom to everyone within its borders, and to everyone who has citizenship here as an American citizen. But this is a direct lifeline thrown towards sort of Christian Catholic schools, and especially in the arguments made, they were using arguments specifically towards the Catholic schools, and so the two sides of the coin here are the conservatives are saying these are educational institutions. Yes, they are religious based, but they're still educational institutions, so that they still deserve some type of funding, right? Or tax incentives or whatever that the other schools get, because it is education for our kids, with albeit a religious spin. The liberals are saying this is too far into us getting us interfering with religious schools in general, right? This is completely kind of blurring that line, or destroying the line of church and state. And so pretty much all the liberals were no on this one, and the conservatives voted obviously yes. But this is a huge monumental win for private schools, any Christian Catholic schools of the such. And so, yeah, it is, we are definitely living in, weird new times here. So big news for the Supreme Court. And as the weeks go on throughout summer and the rest of our semester, we might start seeing even more monumental cases, but I will keep you updated on those. So what do you think about this? Do you think this is right? Do you think that schools, whether they are Christian/Catholic, or let's say worshippers of Islam or Hindu, or what else, Scientology, should all of those schools now have various incentives and taxes for their programs? Because a main critique, and it wasn't on this page, but a main critique that I was reading last night on my phone was there was the columnist was using Montana as an example. It was either Montana or Minnesota, something like that. And they were saying that, let's say you are a taxpayer, and your taxes inevitably, let's say, are going to go and fund these schools because of the tax incentives, etc. But let's say some heavily religious schools that are advocating and putting into practice, let's say, those old religious traditions of, let's say, telling the kids that anyone who is gay is an abomination and deserves to go to hell and burn. Or let's say if the child comes out as gay or transgender or whatever, that they need to go through hormone therapy, and I forgot what the specific word for it is, but they have like that terrible kind of conversion therapy, right, to kind of pray the gay away, sort of, quote unquote. And so let's say if you're a taxpayer and you completely do not agree with that policy, why should you, the taxpayer, be forced to sort of fund these schools, right? So that's like the crux of the argument there. So it's getting pretty messy, but it's clear to see that, like I always keep saying in my classes, wherever there's a skew in politics towards liberal or conservative side, there's always going to be a counter reaction to it. So this is going to be the conservative, counter reaction to the rising sort of liberal movements that we've seen in the last number of years. Just having some discussions on police reform. With all of the George Floyd cases and the protests and everything else that have been coming forth in the last number of weeks, we are seeing more and more police officers across the U.S. just straight up quit their jobs. Many of them are saying no to this entire defunding the police and holding them accountable, and let's say going back into their Facebook or Twitter feeds by like 10 years and firing them because they did or said something in their past. So a lot of them are holding a more middle of the road / conservative views on this, and saying this is, the policies are just getting a little bit too crazy. And so they're just quitting en masse. Now, you could make the argument that, well, if you're going to get so lightly triggered over having a few reforms to, let's say, protect the public, then perhaps you should quit. We don't want you on the force, right? We don't want those type of people patrolling the streets with guns and batons and tasers. And so, there is kind of a backlash, right, happening right now from police officers across the United States, from various unions, because those police unions are very strong and entrenched. And so we are seeing this backlash. However, there's two sides to the coin here. Some are saying that, police reform appears unlikely, that, across the United States, this kind of big general reform of all of these police forces in all of these cities seems unlikely, because each one of them has their own kind of individualized union that fights and negotiates with the city. And so that's very, very entrenched, right? But the other flip side is some cities are actually trying to, kind of, spearhead change. And so, for instance, in New Jersey, in Camden, we had the entire police force absolutely gutted and disbanded, and they built it back up from scratch. So they essentially said, we're going to get rid of everything and nullify it and start from scratch. And so New Jersey and Camden has actually been a very kind of good, positive story of how you could just start fresh, right? And it's an example of really from the bottom up, right? If you are unsure of however many percentage of the police force are, let's say, unfit, or let's say they are just worn down mentally, or they're just not fit to serve the badge at all. One option such as this is to completely dismantle it and just start over, right? And have more rigorous standards for people applying to the force. Now, I do want to make a comment, and I'm not sure exactly, which way this is going to go, but I'm going to try anyways. There's an entire notion of defunding the police. And this is a great podcast on the Joe Rogan podcast with Jocko Willink. He is a public speaker for companies and corporations, but he used to be a Navy SEAL, right? Just super tough, gruff kind of military veteran. And so they were discussing the whole defund the police hashtag and what that means. Now, on the one side, I completely agree that the police forces in America are absolutely looking like a militarized force, right? Military gear, all of these armored trucks. It's too much. And that's the result of years and years of the military just having too much gear and subsidizing it and selling it to the cities. So we essentially have a complete militarized police force where they do not even look like our local community police officers anymore, right? They kind of just look like this, huge, unwieldy force. However, there's this argument that Mr. Willink proposed that I was hearing, which was interesting. He said, let's say the crux of the issue here, or one of the biggest, is, with all of these protests, we are protesting police brutality, but we are protesting probably more than anything else, not enough training for the police, because some of these folks are trigger happy. They are not arresting properly, or let's say de-escalating the situation properly, right? They are not being properly trained onto how to do all of this. And on top of that, they are not consistently being held accountable, right? Every single month, every single year, to kind of check up on them, right? And see how they're doing mentally, if they remember the training, if they remember how to correctly engage with civilians, right? And kind of de-escalate tensions. And so he's proposing that, if anything, we should be shifting funds or maybe increasing funds for the police departments, but in a very specific way to increase training. So he's viewing it in a military, ironic, right? We're trying to demilitarize the police, but he's viewing it from a military perspective in the sense of, let's say, discipline and training, not necessarily gear and militarized equipment, but more in the mindset. And so his argument is that perhaps we need, more funding so that we can have these special programs and increase trainings. Because a lot of these officers, for some of the communities and cities across the U.S., they only need like 3 to 6 months of training, which is, not enough for you to hold guns and tasers and be in charge of the public welfare. And after that, the training kind of just tapers off, So he's saying, in a military perspective, him and his Navy SEALs and other guys, they would consistently just run drills, right? Run different scenarios, how to interact with civilians, how to interact with hostile situations, how to interact with domestic disputes or firefights or whatever, right? And they consistently train themselves, so eventually they feel very calm and they know exactly what to do in any type of situation, right? Because they've been training constantly. Versus, let's say, an officer who only had like a few months of training, was on the force for like 2, 3, 4 years, had like seen no action, no additional training, and then suddenly some situation happens and they kind of get all erratic and then, they go trigger happy. So it's an interesting perspective, right? More training, help them out, and also have consistent psychological evaluations so that if they are on the force for a number of years and they've seen some heavy stuff, that perhaps it's time to phase them out, right? Because they are not as, hardened and equipped to kind of deal with the job anymore, because they're just viewing the civilians as just purely enemies. So an interesting perspective that I just wanted to throw in, and perhaps some solutions, right, towards this entire, situation and protest we've been seeing recently. But let me know what your thoughts are. I would love to hear them. I'm not obviously not, right 100% of the time, but let's have a good dialogue going. For anyone who's been following along on the COVID-19 news, Americans have been banned from Europe. So if anyone had plans to travel to Europe, you have now been banned officially. F's in the chat. So essentially, because America is number one on the list of COVID at the moment, and our numbers are just skyrocketing with absolutely no hope of them subsiding, Europe has officially said that we are banned from traveling to the countries until further notice. And so they're going to, kind of shut us off from international travel. So I guess the United States loves to be number one in everything. Unfortunately, that also includes COVID cases. And so, that is not a pretty look for the United States. And I truly hope that either a vaccine comes out soon or for us to meaningfully implement more kind of masks and kind of public services, etc. So people are going to try to stem the flow of COVID cases. But then again, you see plenty of news cycles where like beaches in Florida open up and people are partying, and obviously the virus is going to spread from there. It's just crazy and ridiculous. And even here around Los Angeles, sometimes I'll still see somebody, let's say at Trader Joe's or wherever else, and they're wearing their mask, but they're kind of wearing their mask where it's underneath their mouth, underneath their nose, so it covers their mouth, but like their nose is completely open, and I'm like, hey, it's a mask, it's not a chin guard, but yeah, hopefully we can get our act together as far as COVID goes. In more international news, Iran is issuing an arrest warrant for U.S. President Trump and asks Interpol for their help. And so essentially, for those of you that did not know, a number of months ago, Donald Trump ordered the drone strike and killing of one of their top generals. So they killed one of Iran's top generals in a drone strike. And so, they've been mulling it over. They were obviously really upset, and they were having protests and kind of demonstrations in Iran, and especially Tehran, Iran. And recently, so Iran just full-blown just said, we want an arrest warrant for President Trump, and once he's not the president anymore, we will still go after him for this act of terror. We'll see, how this kind of plays out, but I doubt the United States is going to acquiesce for these demands. However, this is a perfect example of how United States hegemony around the world and United States respect is slowly declining. Because, we have to understand that we are not the country of the world. We are a country in the world dealing with everyone else, right? And kind of living in a symbiotic relationship. And so, for us to randomly just go in and, let's say, drone strike generals left and right, we can't do that. Those are acts of war. And so other countries are obviously going to get upset, but that deteriorates the moral supremacy that the United States is advocating for. And so if we're not careful, we're just going to waste all of it, and nobody around the world is going to trust the United States anymore. No one around the world is going to want to ally with us, right? We are going to eventually just ostracize ourselves. So something to think about. Last but not least, Hong Kong is going through more upheavals, but the Chinese government has essentially won the fight. So the last number of months, Hong Kong has been going through massive protests because Hong Kong, the city, has essentially been reintegrated into mainland China. But Hong Kong, for the longest time, has been a kind of two-state government where, yes, they're part of China, but they were still kind of under the kind of British common law situation where they had more democratic, practices and ideals and freedom of speech, etc. And so now that China wanted to reincorporate them and kind of rule over them with the Chinese iron fist, as they do, they were obviously protesting. But in recent weeks, the Chinese mainland government has officially passed a series of laws, which states that they can essentially pass any law they want in terms of Hong Kong. And so as far as legal governmental policy goes, the mainland China has officially won over the Hong Kong protesters. And now we are starting to see the first arrests made after they passed a new security law, because they essentially said, you have to stop protesting. It's the law now. And so now they're just arresting people left and right. And so it's, going to be quite difficult for any protesters to be out on the streets because they're going to get arrested. And if they're going to be more vocal after those arrests, there's always the Chinese prisons and gulags. So, you don't want to mess with the Chinese government for sure. It is definitely not something you want to kind of advocate for. But yeah, the news is going absolutely crazy in the last few weeks. This entire year has just been a huge, whirlwind of kind of updates. But what did you think about these news, reels? What did you think about everything going on with the Supreme Court, protests, defunding the police, the American ban on Europe for traveling, and issues with Iran and China? What did you think about all these? Please, throw in some advice or suggestions or some comments in the discussion boards. I would love to hear your thoughts and to get some class interaction going. I hope everyone is doing well and having a fantastic week. And I hope to put out another one of these in a week or so. Take care, everyone.